Hello, I'm Denise Merrill, Secretary of the State of Connecticut. And I've been Secretary of the State for more than a year now, and I've traveled the state discussing the issue of elections and civic engagement with many people. One thing that's come up again and again is the need to bring more young people into the democratic process. In 2010, Connecticut's voters turned out at a rate of 49%. This is slightly higher than the national average turnout, but it's still lower than most other democratic countries in the world. Of course, presidential election years boast the highest turnout numbers because the country as a whole is caught up in the same race. There's more widespread media coverage, and just about everyone has an opinion on what's going on in these elections, even those who don't participate or even plan to vote. One thing that's well documented is that if you engage young people early, they're more likely to stay civically engaged throughout their lives. When I was in the Connecticut House of Representatives, I helped make civics education a required part of the high school learning experience. My Civic Health Advisory Group is currently exploring ways to engage the citizens of Connecticut and has made recommendations about how to improve civic education. But I know there are things we can do right now, such as helping teachers to be as effective as possible by putting the tools and resources they need right at their fingertips and in one place. So I asked educators and others interested in civic involvement, how can we best help educate young people about the democratic process? And their answer? The time is now, with the spotlight on the national election, to bring the 2012 elections into the classroom. So the result is, today, the Connecticut Election Project 2012, a nonpartisan, multidisciplinary curriculum program for teachers of grades 4 through 12, developed by Connecticut teachers for Connecticut teachers. The curriculum is broken into 3 main content areas: election history, election literacy, and election math. Today's webinar is meant to give you the flavor of each content area. This is the first in a series of webinars that will occur throughout the summer to help you prepare for the election. If you're interested in one or more of the content areas we reviewed today, I strongly encourage you to sign up for the summer webinars. Each summer webinar will be 1 hour in length, and teachers will be able to earn CEUs for their participation. Participation in the webinars is absolutely free. There will be 4 summer webinars in all, 1 for each content area, and 1 that focuses specifically on the needs of elementary school teachers. These webinars will be live and interactive, but will also be available for on-demand viewing after the live airings. Supplemental content and links will also be provided on the Secretary of State's website, which I'll give you at the end. After Labor Day arrives and you find yourself back in the classroom, you can expect updates based on the course the election is taking. There will also be a series of webinars geared towards students that will be aired toward the end of September. Again, 1 for each content area, plus 1 for elementary students. A student conference will take place in Hartford following the student webinars. This will involve, among other activities, a meet and greet to which all major candidates for a variety of state and local offices will be invited. And my office would be happy to facilitate classroom visits by me, Deputy Secretary Spallone, or other elected officials and candidates, either at the statewide or local levels. Today, I'm joined by the teachers who are developing this curriculum. They'd like to tell you a bit more about what each content area encompasses, but before I turn this over to them, I want to thank you for taking time to participate in today's webinar. As a former teacher, I know how hard your job is and how important you are to your students' lives. By taking the time to focus on this historic election in your classroom, you're showing your students how important it is to be a knowledgeable, involved member of our community now and in the future. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Steve Armstrong and Elliot Waxman, who will tell you a little more about each content area. So that's election history, election literacy, elementary level, and election math.
First, I want to welcome Elliot Waxman and Steve Armstrong, and thank you for being a part of this today. Let's start with you, Elliot. Can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of the election history webinar?
Well, the election history webinar for the Connecticut Election Project is going to look at the history of elections, campaigns and elections, through 2 overarching themes.
The first is, why is the 2012 election the most important election facing this generation?
This is the way that the campaigns are framing the choice. This is the way the news media is framing the choice. That this is the most important election facing this generation. And essentially, it boils down into two different competing visions for the future. On one hand, you have Barack Obama and the Democrats advocating to be reelected and pushing their agenda and their vision for the future. And on the other hand, you have Mitt Romney and the Republicans offering an alternative vision that will say much about where we go in the future.
Okay. And well, tell me a little bit about incumbency. You're going to be touching on that, right?
Yes, I will, and we will. As you know, the conventional wisdom right now is that Connecticut is historically a blue state, and that Barack Obama it will not be competitive here, that he will win Connecticut's electoral college votes. I want to submit that I think that's a little bit short-sighted in the sense that Connecticut has a history of actually being not so blue as recently as the mid-'80s and early '80s, where we were voting as a Republican state. And so only in recent times has the Democrat carried Connecticut. And so therefore it may be more competitive, and there will be campaign activity going on at the national level. One of the things that we will see as it relates to incumbency is that President Obama is running for re-election, and every re-election campaign is a referendum on the incumbent. So voters are going to be asked, and he's going to try to make a case to be re-elected. He's got some advantages: his ability to raise money, his ability to sort of command the news cycles, but at the same time he's got some disadvantages. The notion that he's got no record to run on now. The economy is not doing as well as we would all like, and now voters are going to be given choice. Also, as it relates to the competitiveness of this state, Governor Romney is from Massachusetts. He is relatively moderate, and he's going to if he has any chance of winning in New England, it would be Massachusetts and Connecticut, and if he is competitive here, he's going to make the case that he should be elected. He's also, both candidates I expect to be in the state throughout the summer and early fall raising money from traditional sources. And so students and teachers may have the experience and be prepared to see these candidates real life as they're in the state.
What about the U.S. Senate race in Connecticut? Elliot mentioned that it may have a national impact. Can you tell us about that, Steve?
Sure, yeah, I think this is going to be a major focus of the unit, of the election history thing, is the U.S. Senate race. Because I think we can get a lot of very interesting themes through this. First off, how a candidate is chosen. The way it looks right now, there's going to be primaries for on both sides. The Republicans, Chris Shays and Linda McMahon, and the Democrats, Chris Murphy and Susan Beisowitz. So this is a window into how Senate candidates are chosen, how candidates in general are chosen. So that's sort of a platform to do that. In addition, through this race, we can talk about balance of power in Washington. I mean, the Senate is supposed to be real close this year, and who wins this race, the Massachusetts race, these races in New England are going to be crucial as far as who controls the Senate next year in Washington. We're also going to be able to use this race, and we're going to go into this quite a bit, in how money impacts politics. I mean, it's well known, she is not the first, nor will she be the last. Linda McMahon has some money, and how is that money used? I mean, 4 years ago, she ran for Senate and spent a boatload of money, and it didn't get her the election. So what really does money get you? How do you use money? That's going to be something we're going to talk about. In addition, we're going to get into gender politics through this election. You know, all kinds of polling last time around showed that Linda McMahon did not connect with women. So very interesting. We're going to look at some of that polling. What does a female candidate, do to connect with women? What do women want in a candidate? So that's going to be an area that we're going to look at. So I think this is going to be a great race to sort of follow this whole process, and sort of using a Connecticut example to get at a lot of both Connecticut things and national things.
Okay. Just for the record, it was 2 years ago that Linda McMahon ran. I know it must seem like it was 4 years
I
ago.
apologize.
And yeah, as you mentioned, voter turnout is probably going to play a significant role in the Senate race because it's so close. Can you talk about voter turnout, Elliot?
Absolutely, and as you know, Tina, that voter turnout traditionally in a presidential election year is higher than it is in an off year or midterm year. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. There's been changes in the way the Connecticut registers its voters, and so some of the impacts, we'll be exploring some of the impact of that, whether it's, there's been changes in terms of absentee ballots and things like that, so that will have a focus of what we're doing. In addition, when you go back to 4 years ago and think about voter turnout, much was made about at that point, Senator Obama trying to expand the electorate, bringing new voters into the mix, whether it was young people who are African American or Hispanic, other kinds of historically local performing voters, and he did a good job of expanding the electorate. There has been some discussion recently. There's been some tail off on the Democratic side and/or an increase in registration nationally for the Republicans. And they sort of took what President or Senator Obama did 4 years ago and tried to mirror it on the Republican side. So those discussions of who actually shows up to vote and what impact it's having is something that we're going to look into.
Okay, and certainly in 2008, President Obama had this really sort of grassroots or netroots energy going on that helped push him over the top. Can you talk about, Steve, how you might look at that?
Yeah, and we're going to look at that a lot, the impact of technology and how candidates, it's not just going out and giving a million speeches and shaking a million hands. I mean, candidates certainly still do that, but how technology is sort of broadened the way that candidates can reach potential voters. And we're going to talk about, the use of the internet and other forms of technology and how they do that. And by the way, a thing that this is a way that's been shown in the past, and we're going to show how some Connecticut candidates right now are trying to use these ways to attract some younger voters. So, as Elliot said, this was done fairly successfully in 2008, and we're going to study how some candidates, both at the national level and the Connecticut level, are trying to do that this year.
Okay. Well, we've been talking a lot about President Obama and Governor Romney. What about third parties? How do they affect the races in the U.S., and are you going to talk about that at all in this area?
Yes, and as you know, historically, presidential election is a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, and the history of third parties is a little bit, it is not very, very good. But Connecticut has a different kind of experience with that, different history with that. We have elected governors in the third party. We've, the current senator, Joseph Lieberman, is an independent. So we'll use that, again, what's going on nationally to what's happening here in the state of Connecticut. What we'll also have an opportunity to do is raise with kids, students, why is it historically a two-party system? We'll focus on things like the electoral college. We'll focus on things like the winner-take-all system that sort of stacks it up against third parties. In addition, and again, depending on how this all plays out, some of the state and local races will have, or conceivably have third-party candidates, and that would be sort of another window into that discussion, that experience for children or for students.
Okay. Well, it certainly seems like you've got a lot of materials to talk about in the summer webinar. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Steve? Or?
Yeah, just one more thing. Another theme of the history webinar is going to be a look at local races, because what we really want kids to do is we want them to study these races that we're talking about now, but we also want kids and teachers to be aware and to look carefully at the state senate race, the state house races. Because you know what, I think some of the stuff going on at the Capitol in Hartford impacts both adults and kids, arguably if not as much, if not more, than what's done in Washington. So part of this is going to be giving resources to kids and to teachers And I suspect your office may be able to help them in doing that as well.
Certainly, I think the Secretary of the State's office will play a big role in helping get any local school that wants to get connected with the local races and give them the information about websites that are out there for the local races and the themes that are going on and so on. Okay. All right, well now let's talk about the election literacy webinar. Let's start with you, Steve. How will you cover the elections with election history?
Well, you know, our goal in this section is a couple things. Is first off to talk about how elections are covered today, and we're going to talk about internet, how the internet covers elections, television, how television, news magazines, and quite frankly how things like tweeting, blogging, the impact of those have on how elections are covered. The other thing we're going to compare that to is how elections were covered in the past, where if you were going to, if you wanted to know about an election, you read about it in the newspaper, and it's very interesting with the conventions coming up. There was a time when you could watch every second of the convention on every network show, on every of the major networks. They went what they called it gavel-to-gavel coverage.
So no choice.
No
really.
choice if you watched it on ABC, CBS, or NBC. Now to get that gavel-to-gavel coverage, one has to go to C-SPAN. So we're going to talk about really how elections are covered by the media, and comparing that how it's done today with how it was done in the past. And I think we'll have some discussions of how that's changed the way people experience and perhaps analyze elections.
Well, certainly one thing that's changed is this whole phenomenon of the 24-hour news channels and talk radio, and then sort of the focus of elections with that. So can you talk a little bit about that, Elliot?
Absolutely. As you know, talk radio is a major way that people get their news now. They have an impact. It is having an impact on the election. It's having an impact on the way we communicate and think about ideas. It will continue to have a big impact. What I would also suggest is that it's having that some of the impact that it's having is actually coarsening the civil discourse. That people no longer talk to each other or discuss issues, but are more interested in debating, yelling, scoring political points, and one only has to look at any of the recent scandals, issues in the news to prove that. What we're going to try and do in this piece of the webinar is to show teachers to how to both acknowledge that that's happening, and then how to bring it to a classroom where kids can talk to one another and learn how to communicate in a civil way, looking at controversial issues, discussing them, thinking about them, understanding that it's not always as black and white as it's made out in talk radio, with the idea that the discourse in the classroom is at the civil level.
Okay.
And it's very interesting. There's the cry, we should be more civil. There should be more civil discourse, which there should be. But I just saw on a news report yesterday that CNN, which compared to MSNBC or Fox News is probably the most balanced, is their ratings right now are at the lowest level in their history.
Wow.
So if people want, we want more balanced news, they're not showing that by their voting, by their viewing patterns right now.
What about political TV ads? We see them all the time. Are you going to cover that?
Sure. We're going to do historical ads. We want to show, and many teachers know these already, but we just want to show maybe some of the beginning teachers, or just to remind some of the vets of some of the classic ads of all time. I mean, we're going to show teachers where you can get those. They're real easy to get. We're going to show on the webinar some of the earliest ads from the 1952 Eisenhower campaign, the first TV ads that we could come up with. There's a famous ad from Lyndon Johnson, the Daisy ad, which is, I just saw there was a book written about that one ad, just about one advertisement. There's a Willie Horton commercial. So all of these classic commercials, the Morning in America commercials that Ronald Reagan made, that many credit for his electoral success. But we're also going to talk about, ads at the local level. the ads that Linda McMahon, senatorial candidate, is coming out with this year, where she's emphasizing family, she's emphasizing her poor roots, very, very different ads than she made 2 years ago. So we're going to sort of talk about, at both the local and national level, what are candidates trying to get across when their ads, who are they trying to reach in their ads. So this should be an interesting section of this, I think.
Okay. What about, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, what about Hollywood, and how, do they have any effect on elections, or are you going to
Well,
hear that
I can
again?
tell you that we've got, the American political system is a great subject for Hollywood. And there's been, there's books written about, movies that Hollywood has made about politics. And we're going to show, again, many of the teachers will know some of these, but we're going to show the teachers some of the clips and how to get at some of the movies that show politics in a very cynical light. There's a movie, The Candidate, with Robert Redford. There's a movie, Bob Roberts, with Tim Robbins. Very cynical views of the political system. And there's also some movies, the most obvious that comes to mind, a movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that shows a very positive view of politics. So we want kids and teachers to get both sides. We're also going to show them some television stuff that they can use, some comedic, some not. I know many teachers use the West Wing and segments of the West Wing in their classes to show various points and political points that they're trying to make in a government or a history class. Not that this should be any kid or teacher's only source of news, but the Daily Show and the Colbert Report are very interesting takes on the American political process. Saturday Night Live humor, it's funny, but to get the humor, the kid has to know enough about the person that's being satirized. So using that, there's a show right now on HBO, Veep, which is another sort of comedic takeoff on the political process. And we're also going to, by the way, bring in some campaign songs. There's a couple websites that we're going to recommend that has every campaign, a song from every campaign ever. So if we're going to show the teachers, if they want to know what the Millard Fillmore stood for in his campaign, we're going to play them a song, the Millard Fillmore Express, that shows them. So we're going to do television, we're going to do movies, and we're going to do music, and how those things can be used to study the electoral process.
Wow, that sounds great. Elliot, are there other resources that you'll be discussing?
Absolutely, and to sort of echo what Steve's saying, there are a myriad of resources on the web and throughout, easily accessible, that teachers can link to, that students can access, that we'll provide a sampling of those for you.
All right, let's talk about the elementary level. Are you going to have any materials for elementary students?
We are. A major focus of this is going to be for the elementary school student and for the elementary school teacher. And we're aware, by the way, that many elementary school teachers, this is not an area, this is not a subject that many of them have studied. But we know that there's many elementary school teachers who want to study the election. So our goal in this webinar is going to be to help those folks. Where can we find information? Where do we start to get information? I think what we're going to do here, as with the high school and middle school webinars, we're going to help teachers and elementary school students study both the national races, and we also want them to be aware and be able to study the local races as well. And the lessons are going to be inquiry-based lessons. All of the elementary school lessons will be inquiry-based lessons. There'll be differentiated lessons, so that if you have students in your class of different abilities, we'll have activities for them. And a real goal of this is to get a third grader or a fourth grader or a second grader to have an appreciation of politics. Many won't, but if our goal is if we can hook some kids into this and get kids to find this as interesting at an early age, then this has been a success.
Okay. What kind of tools will be provided for elementary teachers?
Elementary school teachers will find a whole host of resources in this project. Teachers can expect to find book lists, websites, student interactives, web links, links to help students ask, answer, and assess questions about the process, the history of voting, the importance of voting, why their opinion counts, the basics that we need to teach elementary school kids about democracy. The lessons will have additional resources to help fill in background material and information for students and teachers who are unfamiliar with the process.
Okay. Will elementary materials be tied to the secondary level materials?
Yeah, absolutely. What we're gonna have for each of the 3 high school webinars, we're gonna have one section of each of those webinars that's gonna be covered for elementary school teachers. So it's the same, but we're just picking one thing from each of the webinars. And for each elementary lesson, there's gonna be a 4-lesson sequence. So for every elementary topic, we're gonna have 4 lessons. And then we're gonna have an assessment. So there's gonna be a test, if you wanna call it that an elementary school teacher can use. We think that each of the elementary lessons will be 20, 30 minutes in length, so easily done in the class period. And again, that we want these to be used for varied abilities and various grades. And what we're gonna have as resources, suggested resources, picture books, current event materials. We're gonna suggest some magazines for young readers, some media resources for young readers, and some nonfiction books for young readers. So what we really wanna do in this is give the teacher a pretty wide variety of materials they can use to study this.
Okay, that sounds great. What will you focus on for election history?
In election history, we'll focus on the topic of incumbency. And this is going to include a whole number of things, including background information on what an incumbent is, why voters would re-elect an incumbent. Examples where students will be asked to create T-charts brainstorming the advantages and disadvantages of re-electing incumbents. Students will be given, or teachers will be given resources for cooperative learning where students can identify national and state incumbents in order to figure out and bring the election back to the classroom, and why it is necessary to re-elect an incumbent, or why voters think it's necessary to re-elect an incumbent. Students will be looking at similarities, differences, comparing and comparisons and connections to the state and local elections and national elections. We'll also, as in the high school webinars, looking at the Connecticut Senate race, asking the question, have students looking at the question, are there even incumbents in this race? And since we know there aren't, what factors would have somebody not run for re-election? Lastly, this will also have an assessment piece. For example, students will be asked to write a persuasive letter to their family explaining what an incumbent is, why people might vote for an incumbent, how often incumbents are elected or re-elected both nationally and statewide, advantages and disadvantages of both re-election and voting for a challenger.
Okay. Now, what about election literacy?
Sure, in the election literacy piece, we're assuming that many of the students who will be doing this probably have never studied elections before. So what we're going to start off with, if you want to study an election, where are the sources to go? I mean, we're going to start off, where in the newspaper can you find things in magazines? What type of TV? So really, we're starting very simply with, if you're going to study an election, where do you go to study it? And then secondly, if you get to the right place, if you get to a place that's studying the election, what type of information do they provide to you? Is it all objective? Is it not objective? So really, what type of material is available? We're also going to study at the elementary level the effect of the internet on elections. And how is the coverage on the internet maybe different than the coverage you've seen in other areas? So this will be interesting. And again, we're going to focus our media look on this Connecticut Senate race and how the ads in that race and how news reports in that race that an elementary school student can read and analyze. What are they telling us about the political process? So it is, again, we'll emphasize that this is on an elementary level, but what we really want the kids to do in this section is, if we want to study a political race, if we want to look at politics in any way, where do we go? Where do we start to do that?
Great. It sounds like the elementary teacher webinar is going to be full of a lot of interesting materials.
That's our hope. Our big goal at the elementary level for this webinar is that teachers will be provided with inspiration, resources, curriculum connections to have their students reading, writing, presenting information about the 2012 local, state, and federal elections.
Thank you. Okay, so tell me about how election math fits into all of this.
Well, Tina, as you know, that civic engagement is a essential part of the Connecticut State Social Studies standards. To paraphrase them, it suggests that students apply content and skills to historical and contemporary issues through activities that apply information learned through other aspects of social studies to achieve a deeper awareness and understanding of contemporary issues. So the Connecticut Election Project's math webinar fits that objective nicely. The focus is, as the name suggests, will be on numbers, but it's going to be more than just simply do the math.
Okay. And what are some of the focuses of this area?
Sure. This area, Tina, the election math webinar is going to highlight 5 major areas, and each of them are connected back, as Elliot said, they're each connected back to the Connecticut Social Studies standards and frameworks. And they're also going to be, there's going to be suggested websites and other sources for teachers to get this information as well. The 5 key areas of this webinar are going to be polling, the Electoral College, redistricting, voting and turnout, and election night returns. So all very, very interesting and hopefully very engaging topics for students.
Okay. Briefly walk me through some of those. Let's start with polling.
Well, the polling section is going to be, I think, an area of fertile ground for students and teachers. It's going to cover the nuts and bolts of polling, how polling is done, what is the sample size, what are demographics, how they're determined, margin of error, so the nuts and bolts of the polling process. In addition, it's going to cover how the media and candidates use polls, and how public opinion polls impact the election process, the so-called horse race reporting in the media, or the day-to-day interaction, the impact that polls have on candidate campaigns. There's going to be a focus for students to understand, to be informed consumers of polls, how they're used and misused, and what citizens should look like and what students should look like when they hear about polls. We're also very fortunate here in Connecticut to have Quinnipiac University. They're the sponsor of one of the most respected polls nationwide. And so using the data that they have, that they provide online and through their press releases, it'll give students an opportunity to work with real data coming, live data. The goal of this is to emphasize 21st century skills and 21st century technology, to have students review, analyze, discuss up-to-the-minute results in polling, and how they affect the presidential election and the U.S. Senate race here in Connecticut.
Okay. And what about the Electoral College?
Yeah, this is going to be, Tina, an important part of this because there's many students and regrettably a few teachers that don't understand this. So this is an important part of this. And what we're going to explain in this area is, why we have an electoral college, why historically the founding fathers put the electoral college in. We're going to talk about the drawbacks, how the electoral college works and potential drawbacks of the system. We're going to talk about a couple cases in history, where the presidential candidate won the popular vote and lost in the electoral college. The most recent of that, of course, the year 2000 election. And we're going to talk about how the electoral college impacts a presidential campaign strategy. That if a state has a lot of electoral votes, a candidate's going to show up there. Where if a state only has 1, 2, 3 electoral votes, candidate's not going to go there. So it's going to be the impact of the electoral college on the campaigning process is going to be a feature of this. We're going to talk briefly about states that don't require electors to vote as the voters did. And there's always there's been a move to eliminate the electoral college, and we're going to talk about sort of the merits of that as well. So this should be an interesting section. I think if this is going to be a close presidential race, as many people think it's going to be, then boy, the electoral college is gonna be a real important part of students studying this election in the fall, and our goal in this webinar is to prepare the students.
Okay. Tell me about how redistricting fits in with this.
Well, Tina, as you know, redistricting is tied into the federal census that is that we're required to take every 10 years, and the most recent one was 2010. And what the way the process works is that states are required to use the data from the census to adjust for population shifts and movement among citizens around the country and around the state. And so the state of Connecticut just went through a redistricting process. At the federal level, we were fortunate not to lose any representation in Washington, and so the changes were not that great. But again, there were some changes, and politicians, the members of Congress, are going to have to adapt to that and the way their districts now look. At the state level, there were more changes. Based on internal shifts within the state of Connecticut. And we've had some situations where local races are going to be impacted at, where two incumbents now share the same district, and that leaves them with the question whether or not they should run against one another, or whether one person should retire or one person should seek a different office. And so we'll be able to look at those kind of things. Students will be able to look at that. In addition, I mean, this is the whole concept of gerrymandering, and from a math standpoint or a geography standpoint, students will have the opportunity to look at redistricting from that lens.
Okay. And what about voting turnout?
Yeah, this we think is going to be a real interesting section of this webinar, because we're going to explore in this section how different groups vote, how different groups in Connecticut and in American society as a whole vote. Many people credit that in the 2008 election, many people credit the youth vote for helping to elect Barack Obama. And we're going to study how does the youth, what's it look like in 2012? Is that youth vote still there? We're going to also study how and suggest ways for teachers to study how other groups vote. How do senior citizens vote and why? How do people living in cities compared in rural areas vote and why? How do certain ethnic, racial groups vote and why? So really, we're going to try to break down the vote as a whole into different segments and help students and teachers analyze why and how groups vote in certain ways. And we're also going to suggest in this that students may want to look at a certain town. How does people in their own town vote? Or even if they live in a larger community, how do people in their voting district vote and why? So this is really not, it's going to be a look at like how Connecticut votes as a whole and how the United States votes as a whole, but probably more importantly than that, breaking that down into how specific groups vote.
Okay. Tell me about election night results. That sounds exciting.
Well, the election night results section, this could be why we're doing the whole project, all of these webinars. If these races are as close as many predict, it's going to be real time, it's going to be exciting. Students are going to hopefully be engaged and be watching the results as they come in. We'll have resources for teachers to help students make predictions about what the outcomes will be, both at the electoral college level, state by state, but also at the state and local level. Depending on how it plays out and what the situation looks like, other issues that we may be looking at and that may be pertinent are the ethics of calling a state before the polls are closed. And there are several examples throughout history where that has had at least some impact on outcomes. In addition, exit polling is a topic that people ask about all the time, and this will give students an opportunity to understand what exit polls are, how they work, and why they're used by the networks. So this one, again, depending on how close the elections are on election night, has an opportunity to really have students engaged in the process.
That's great. Is there anything else you want to let teachers know about election math?
Yeah, I would one thing I'd want to say is that we are in contact, and we've spoken to a couple. Connecticut has some really top-notch polling places and some top-notch pollsters, and we're hopefully going to get those, at least one or two of those folks involved in the webinar that we're gonna do this summer. And I think it'll be really interesting for teachers and for students to be able to hear, really from real life, how people that really work in this field operate. So I think that'll be a great addition to the webinar that we're gonna do this summer.
Great, Elliot?
I just want to add too, that the election math section of the webinar, the election math webinar is going to give students a lot of wonderful opportunities to broaden their understanding of the whole process and sort of see how the system works and the mechanics and the nuts and bolts behind it, and hopefully give them a real good understanding of the election process.
Okay. Well, thank you, Elliot and Steve, for the information you've provided us with today. And I can't wait to see what happens with the webinars this summer. And now we'll return to Secretary Merrill for some upcoming dates and some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Tina, Steve, and Elliot. That was very informative. Don't forget to visit www.ct.gov/SOTS for more information on the Connecticut Election Project 2012. Sign up now for the summer webinar series. Election history will be held on July 10th. Election literacy will be held on July 17th. Election math will be held on July 24th. And the elementary webinar will be held on July 31st. Thanks again to all of you who've taken the time to participate today, and please share this with your coworkers as well. Thanks again.